This is Tommy Smith with Rattle and Hum Sports. We are here with Kevin Lonnquist to do our weekly Big 12 video cast. Kevin, thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
Kevin, we'd like to start out with the action last week in the Big 12, and big game, of course, was that Notre Dame-Oklahoma game. Tell me what you saw in that game, Oklahoma losing to Notre Dame.
You know, what I saw was the fact that I think a lot of people had thought that Notre Dame was a team that, you know, that were the house of cards because offensively they had struggled so much. That defensively there weren't any questions, but they were going to be playing against a team that was very explosive offensively. They were going to be doing it on their turf, and the question was whether or not Notre Dame could handle it. And not only did they handle it, they were excellent. I mean, I was very, very impressed with how Everett Golson, their quarterback, stood up, met the challenge, throws the big touchdown late in the game that creates separation. OU really had problems. I mean, Oklahoma moved the ball up and down the field in some respects, but when it came down to getting into the red zone, that's when they got shut down. And I think it's a testament to how Notre Dame was physical with the Sooners in the red zone, where the Sooners really couldn't respond. You know, the Sooners' running game has had some problems here. Damian Williams has been only held to 73 yards the last two games, 29 I think it was last week against the Irish. So when they really needed to do something between the tackles, they couldn't really do that, and I think that's what the difference was in that football game.
And then the other game, Kansas State's just been rolling all season long, and rolled again last week.
Yep.
Tell me a little bit about what you saw, there.
Well, I mean, it was pretty much business as usual for Bill Snyder's kids. I mean, Tech did everything right in the first half, kept the game close. They actually scored first, took the lead, and it was a 13-10 game at the half. And then Kansas State just imposes its will, takes over the game in the second half, and Colin Klein is his usual methodical stuff. I think the one thing that you like about Colin Klein is how well he's now throwing the football. About 240 yards last week. He was 323 the week before at West Virginia. So there's a lot more confidence in Kansas State's ability to throw the football, and that's going to be really important for them because they've obviously got the running game with Colin John Hubert in the backfield, but if you can throw it like they're doing it, and they don't have to sling it like a lot of these spread teams like a Baylor does or West Virginia does or somebody like that, but they're creating enough balance so that now teams really have to be concerned about what the Wildcats are doing in both aspects of their offense.
And then talk just a little bit about Colin Klein and the Heisman Trophy. Obviously, he's getting a lot of talk. Was Geno Smith, in the beginning of the season? How do you see, that playing out the rest of the season?
Well, I think that as long as Kansas State keeps winning, it might be in a position to play for a national championship. I don't see why Colin won't be one of the top 2 or 3 candidates for that coveted trophy. If you look at the way that he's played, and it really, the national perception on him switched at the West Virginia game. He outplays Geno Smith without question. Counts for 7 touchdowns in the game. I mean, on a big stage, and he performs really, really well. Same thing on a night game in Norman against Oklahoma, where the Wildcats won that game. Mm-hmm. So in those 2 games of consequence, that's where he really stepped up and made a difference. Now, he'll get another test against a solid Oklahoma State team, but it won't carry the same kind of impact as it did against West Virginia and Oklahoma. As long as he doesn't make major mistakes and have a horrible game, which I don't expect him to, but then again, this is college football where it can change on a week-to-week basis. But I think that he's going to be one of the top 2 or 3 candidates for it as long as the season keeps going for the Wildcats as what we've seen to this point.
And on the site, Rattle and Hum Sports, you had talked a little bit about one of the things that we've seen throughout the season is turnovers and how they're affecting certain teams. Expand a little bit more about that for us, if you could.
It's a killer. I mean, every coach talks about it, and it's probably more of a cliche than anything, but every coach talks about how turnovers are the difference in the game and how they're going to basically change how teams play. I mean, it can create a short field. A pick six can absolutely flip the momentum of a football game. But I'll give you a perfect example. Baylor on this 4-game losing streak has turned it over 13 times. That's not a surprise. And when you turn it over, especially like 6 times like they did against TCU, you're going to lose. Texas Tech in its 2 conference losses against Oklahoma and then against Kansas State. 3 turnovers each of those games, 6 total in those 2 games. They only had 1 takeaway why they lost those 2 football games. TCU, look at them. They had 3 turnovers last week in Stillwater against the Cowboys. They had 3 more turnovers in their loss against Texas Tech the week before. They had 5 in the loss to Iowa State. So that's 11 turnovers right there in those 3 losses. I mean, it just all strings together. It just seems though like we're having a lot more turnovers where I don't know if it's a ball security or a carelessness or not paying attention to details kind of thing, but it's just kind of like one of those things in the Big 12 where this is like the year of the turnover really making an impact in football games.
It's all good points. Let's talk about the schedule this week. The big game, I think, on the schedule is Oklahoma State at Kansas State. Let's start there. What do you think we'll see in that ball game?
Well, Wes Lund was very credible in his performance last week, coming back against TCU. He had a hard time, obviously, working through the knee injury, and he got off to a little bit of a flat start. And really, the Cowboys got off to a flat start as they fell behind 14-0. But he was able to rally them, and they got into a position to where they pulled away from the Horned Frogs and won the game. Now that he's got a week of condition reps and he's got that game behind him, I suspect that Wes will play pretty well. I think it's going to be very important, though, for Joseph Randall, the running back, to have a big ball game to take some of the pressure off of Lund, because going into Manhattan against a team that doesn't beat itself, they don't turn it over. They're plus 12 in the turnover ratio this year. They aren't committing penalties. They have less than 30 this year. So they're going to have some really good play offensively. They're going to have to be really smart with the football. One element of this game that we're probably going to see, though, is what the Oklahoma State defense does against Colin Klein. And that defense has really played well over the last 3 weeks. I think it's 4 touchdowns that they've surrendered total in the last 3 games. And Mike Gundy talked about the bye week that they had really made an impact for them, or a difference for them, if you will. And I think we're going to see them give a real spirited effort. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if they push the Wildcat.
And Kevin, next game on the schedule is a game that Rattle and Hum Sports will be attending. It's out in Lubbock, Texas, visiting Texas Tech. What do you see in that ball game?
Well, it's a little bit of irony here, because the fact that Jonathan Gray, the coveted running back for Texas, will be making his first start. He's coming off his first 100-yard game last week against Kansas, but his father, James, was an All-Southwest Conference running back for Spike Dykes at Tech. So that's kind of a neat side note to this game. I think this game really comes down to the quarterback play. Seth Dagey is a very established leader, one of the better signal callers in the conference. I would probably put him, I'm not ashamed or afraid to say he's probably the number 2 quarterback in this conference right now, behind Colin Klein at Kansas State. Texas got their quarterbacking situation a little bit in a flux last week when David Ash was ineffective and had to be taken out of the Kansas game. But the good news is that Case McCoy was able to respond and get that team down the field to pull out the last-second victory in Kansas. But Ash will start, so he's going to have to take the lessons that he learned in Lawrence and apply them in Lubbock. Now, Lubbock's a really difficult place to play. Now, the Longhorns have won 8 out of the last 9 meetings, and they have won some really tight ball games out there against Texas. But I would favor the Red Raiders in this one, just because they've looked better and they've played better all year. And Texas sometimes looks like it has a hard time getting out of its own way. The one element, though, is the turnovers. As rough as Texas has looked over the course of the season, though, Tommy, is the fact that they don't turn it over. They're number 2 in the conference in turnover ratio, whereas Tech is number 8 in the conference in turnover ratio at -4. So if the Longhorns secure the football, they'll be in it. I still think Tech will win this game.
And 2 teams that desperately need a win. We got to see that TCU-Texas Tech game. TCU travels out to Morgantown to face West Virginia for just the second time. What do you see in that game?
Well, it's a little bit of a different week for Gary Patterson's team, especially when he takes his team on the road, because the hurricane that moved through the Northeast, Hurricane Sandy, they had to back their travel plans up a little bit. And instead of flying out early Friday and then going through their walkthrough and seeing Marlin Pusker Stadium for the first time the day before they play, they can't do that. They had to do all their walkthrough stuff in Fort Worth before they get into Pittsburgh Friday night. And the Horned Frogs, though, they're going to have to just deal with it. They've got a ton of injuries on that team right now. Trevon Boykin, Patterson said, should play even though he tweaked the knee. It's going to be a question as to whether or not Matthew Tucker, their running back, can play in spite of his high ankle sprain. That's really difficult for running backs to fight through. You got Brandon Carter, one of the wide receivers, who's dealing with an ankle. I also think he's dealing with a knee injury because the way that he came out of the ball game against Tech, although no one from TCU is talking about that. And then you've also got Stanley Mapanga, their noted defensive end, who hasn't played the last 2 games because of his foot injury, and he might be on the precipice of being shut down for the season if that foot injury persists. So with all that going against the Frogs, then they've lost their last 2. First time they've lost back-to-back games since 2007. They're going against an equally wounded West Virginia team wounded from the standpoint that they're not playing very well defensively. They got the nation's worst pass defense, and they've just given up a ton of points, 114 points in the last 2 ball games with Tech and to Kansas State, and they had the bye week last week. Will they have enough to probably hold off TCU? Probably, because the game is in Morgantown, but because TCU's offense now is starting to look like it's starting to have some issues, especially on the road.
And then Oklahoma travels to Iowa State. It's been somewhat of a surprise, I think, in the conference, playing as well as they have. How do you think OU bounces back after that game against Notre Dame?
Well, I'll put it to you this way. When you look at the history of the series of these teams against each other, this is the one that stands out to me that just makes your mouth drop. And, you know, OU under Bud Wilkinson and Chuck Fairbanks and Barry Switzer, they just ran right over Iowa State over the course of the years. And the history of that is that OU leads the series 69-5-2. I mean, how do you win only 5 games in 76 games? I mean, it's just mind-boggling, but that's what the Sooners have done. I expect the Sooners to roll, or not roll, but probably win. I mean, this could be very similar to the Iowa State-Kansas State game from a couple weeks ago, where Iowa State really fought the Wildcats, but came up a score short. I think OU will have its issues. They've got to get Damian Williams going in their running game, or else they're going to have problems in that Iowa State secondary, which already has a lot of turnovers and creates a lot of turnovers anyway, is going to have a field day and sit back and wait for Landry Jones. I mean, there's been a lot of public outcry in Norman about the way Landry's played this year. Bob Stoops doesn't like to hear that, but there's a lot of people who aren't real fans of Landry.
Right.
I think the Sooners can win the game, and probably should win the game, because they're just better than the Cyclones. And you know, I kind of look at what Iowa State did offensively against Baylor last week as kind of like a one-game wonder, because Baylor's defense is so bad, and OU's defense is one of the best in the country. So if they are able to put over 500 yards against OU's defense, with the quarterback issues they've had between Steele Jans, who will get the start, and Jared Barnett, then that'll be news to me. I could see something like maybe a 28-21 Oklahoma win, something along those lines.
And then last game on the card, Kansas is going to travel south to Baylor to face the Bears in a game that both those teams did a win. Is this the week that Charlie Weiss gets it done?
I would give them a shot. This is Baylor's homecoming, and really, if you look at the way the Jayhawks have played, I mean, they're pretty tough in their own building. They've had 1-score losses to Oklahoma State and to Texas. I mean, when they've gone on the road, now look, their 2 road games in the conference haven't been so good. You know, they had to go to Kansas State, which isn't very fun. They had to go to Norman and play OU, which also isn't very fun, and they got drilled in those 2 games. I think from their standpoint, though, I think the Jayhawks can give the Bears some trouble. I mean, they've been running the football really, really well with James Sims, who has 4 consecutive 100-yard rushing games. He's really done a nice job of stabilizing that. And Charlie Weiss said on the call earlier this week that they really are trying to play to the strengths of their offense, which is their running game. So I think if they can control the clock at Baylor, they're going to have a chance. But if Baylor doesn't turn it over like they have been doing over the last few weeks, then the Bears should probably handle this game, because you've got the nation's top receiver in Terrence Williams. And as much as Nick Florence, Baylor's quarterback, has struggled with turnovers and interceptions, he still has enough weapons to really make Kansas's life difficult.
And one thing we always like to do at the end here is talk about our power rankings for the conference and your power rankings. We've had a good bit of the season to look at them. Where do you got your team standing now?
Well, really nothing changed from the top 4 slots. I still have Kansas State number 1. I have Oklahoma number 2 in spite of the loss to Notre Dame. I have number 3. I have Texas Tech. Number 4 is West Virginia. Number 5, I moved up to Oklahoma State. And really, the results kind of speak for themselves. And then your latter half is kind of what it is, a mixture between Baylor, Kansas, Iowa State, Texas, and TCU. But really, those are probably the top 5 teams in the conference right now.
Well, we're really looking forward to the card this week. That Oklahoma State-Kansas State game should be great. It'll be great being out in Lubbock to see Texas and Texas Tech go at it. We look forward to joining you again next week. Do this again.
I look forward to it myself. Thanks, Tommy.
All right.